Alrighty, well, let's get into this. I looked up the Oxford Dictionary for the meaning of the word storm. And it says here that it's a violent disturbance of the atmosphere with strong winds and usually rain, thunder, lightning or snow. Thankfully, we don't live in a part of the world where we experience the worst of storms, right? The hurricanes and tornadoes that we're seeing on the TV even this week in America. But we do know what a good storm is, don't we? Especially here at Embassy. There'll be some of you that will remember the 3 inches of water that was over the entire venue the year before last. So we do kind of understand how turbulent, violent, rain, thunder. We've seen water coming underneath. No snow in Sydney, but we know what a good storm is, right? We know that it can be very destructive. What I didn't think about in all my life until I was preparing this message, I thought the idea of the series being good storms, I thought, what are the benefits of a storm? Can a storm be a good thing? And actually, I was surprised to find out that storms actually have a really good purpose to them. They're really important in the atmosphere and across the globe. Storms, because of the violent nature of them, they force water, they force change in the atmosphere and in the weather that nothing else can. So areas that are dry, it will take a storm to push the water over there often. The water, because of the volume of the water, it'll wash minerals back into the water, back into the ocean, back into the waterways that it needs. So it's this kind of balancing of the weather and the environment. It breaks up bad algae and it does all sorts of really, really important things. A storm does. So I thought that was very interesting that actually storms have a good purpose. So it's a really good theme that Pastor Ree's come up with, this good storms. She's onto it. We also understand storms as a metaphor, don't we, for life? And that meaning in the Oxford Dictionary is a tumultuous reaction, an uproar, or a controversy. I don't know whether we quite think of it in exactly those terms, but we understand a storm being a really difficult situation with serious consequences in our lives. And they come in many and varied forms, these metaphorical storms in our life. Perhaps they're relationship. We think, oh man, love's on the rocks, it's a bit stormy in this relationship. Or perhaps it's a health storm that some of our family are going through now. Perhaps it's financial, perhaps it's emotional, whatever it is. We kind of get this idea that through life we go through things that feel like they're very serious and that we're not sure how they're going to work out, and they feel very uncomfortable and they feel very tumultuous. I think everyone's experienced them, right? Everybody understands what I mean. Life is full of these storms as well. There's a quote from the movie The Princess Bride, which says, "Life is pain, and anyone who says differently is selling something." And that is so true, isn't it? I don't know when you came to faith in Jesus, I don't know whether you were sold a half-truth, which is that it is the truth that coming to Jesus makes everything better. And that's true. But it doesn't mean that actually we're not going to go through tough times. Sometimes people forget to tell us that. And then we get shocked when tough things happen in our life and we think, where are you, God? But the truth is that the Bible is clearly not selling anything. If you've read the Bible, if we've read the Bible, we will see in there that it is full of the good times, the mountaintops, the praising God times, and it's full of people's experiences where they were going through really difficult times and what we would call storms. Genesis 3, Adam and Eve have they've sinned and they've disobeyed God, sin's come into the world. And then Genesis 3 is all God saying, it's going to be hard, it's going to be stormy, there's going to be storms along the way. Life, working the soil is going to be hard, childbirth is going to be hard. There's not a lot of good news in Genesis 3, except that God would be with them and take care of them. But it's going to be hard. It's going to be full of storms. Then as we go through the Bible, we see again this mix of people praising God, people having wonderful lives, and people really suffering. Wisdom literature is all about that. We see Job, Andrew referred to Job. Most of Job is Job suffering and crying out to God because he's going through this shocking storm in his life. I love Psalm 88. The last line of Psalm 88 says, "Darkness is my only friend." Full stop. That's the end of the psalm. There's no redeeming feature. There's no, but yet I will praise you, God. And I think if God was selling something, he would not put Psalm 88 in the Bible. Psalm 88 is there to let us know that other people have been at a place where they've called out and said, "Where are you, God? I'm going through this terrible storm in my life." And actually, darkness feels closer than you do at the moment. Darkness is my only friend. As we move then through the Old Testament and into the New Testament, we come to Jesus. And what we see of Jesus is that he did not actually have a great life. Have you ever thought about that? Jesus' life was not easy. He experienced many storms through his life, right up into his death. And it wasn't just the crucifixion, it was right through. And I think the Bible really wants us to have a look and to see that Jesus was despised, he was rejected, he was misunderstood, he was persecuted, he was betrayed in ministry, and personally by almost everyone in his life let him down. And Philip Yancey had this great quote. He's a Christian author, and he said, "When everything looks crazy in the world, just focus on Jesus. When you think, why am I going through this stuff in life? Let's just look at Jesus and see what he went through and understand how he did it, what we can learn from him." Great verse, Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2 says, keep your eyes on Jesus, who both began and finished this race we're in. Study how he did it, because he never lost sight of where he was headed. That exhilarating finish in and with God. He could put up with anything along the way, the cross, shame, whatever. Whatever storm it was in Jesus' life, he was somehow able to put up with it and journey through it. I was wondering, I was thinking as I was preparing for this message, what would we focus on? And I thought of Jesus, and the thought came to me, when did the storm start for Jesus? If he had them throughout his life, when did they start? Well, they probably started at birth, but he probably wasn't really aware of it then. He's just a brand new baby. But when was it that Jesus actually first realised that there were storms in life and this life wasn't going to be easy, it was going to be full of storms? And I thought of a story that is one of my all-time favourites in the Bible. I just love this story, and so I thought we might have a look at it today and have a look at this storm in Jesus' life. This storm is probably not crucifixion level storm, but it's a different sort of a storm. It's a relational storm. It's a storm between Jesus and his family, much closer to home. It's in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 2, verses 41 to 52. This, just a little bit of background about this story. It's the only story of Jesus' childhood and younger years that's recorded anywhere in the Bible. So it's a really, and remember that the person who would have given this information to Luke was not a disciple. He was a doctor who wrote about, he wrote from eyewitnesses, he gathered the information. And Luke would have got this story from Mary. Mary, the disciples and Jesus didn't kind of know each other at this point when this story happened. The person who told this story was Jesus' mother, Mary. And I think it's significant for all those reasons, but I think it's significant because it's significant to Mary. And she wanted us to understand this little storm in their life along the journey and what we can learn from it. So let's read the story together, and I'm going to have to read from there because I didn't put it in my notes here. All right, every year, Jesus' parents travelled to Jerusalem for the feast of Passover. When he was 12 years old, they went up as they always did for the feast. When it was over and they left for home, Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but his parents didn't know it. Thinking he was somewhere in the company of the pilgrims, they journeyed for a whole day and then began looking for him among the relatives and the neighbours. When they didn't find him, they went back to Jerusalem looking for him. The next day, they found him in the temple, seated among the teachers, listening to them and asking questions. The teachers were quite taken with him, impressed with the sharpness of his answers. But his parents were not impressed. They were upset and hurt. His mother said, "Young man, why have you done this to us? Your father and I have been half out of our minds looking for you." He said, "Why were you looking for me? Didn't you know that I had to be here dealing with the things of my father?" But they had no idea what he was talking about. So he went back to Nazareth with them and lived obediently with them. His mother held these things dearly deep within herself, and Jesus matured, growing up in both body and spirit, blessed by both God and people. It's a great little story, isn't it? It was a thing back then, and I think for many of our cultures, this kind of sharing of our families and our kids is part of it. So it wasn't unusual that Jesus could be coming home with a family member, a grandparent, a cousin, a friend, whoever. He could be coming back with them. And so I wonder if it's because Jesus had always done the right thing. Every year he was where he should be, travelling back with the family, that they didn't think about it. They thought, okay, yeah, well, here we go, we're all going and everyone's together. And then when they got home, they realised a whole day later that he wasn't there. I don't know, have you ever lost a child for a time? I've lost a child for a time. I remember the boys playing outside. I could hear them playing, and I was in the garden or inside. I could hear them. We lived in a cul-de-sac, and there were lots of kids, and they're all riding their bikes and they're playing around. And then it went quiet, and so I thought, I better go and get the kids and bring them back in. They're probably about, 4 and 5 or something like that. And I went out and there's nothing, nobody in the street. I thought, all right, well, they've gone to a friend's house. So I went over and knocked on the door, and those kids were home, but my kids weren't there. And then I progressively went down the street knocking on everyone's door. At every door that I knocked on, my anxiety levels were getting higher and higher, and they were nowhere in the street. So I left the street and I was up and down the street that was running against ours, and I was beside myself. And about 15 or 20 minutes later, maybe half an hour later, they just appeared out of someone's yard. I think they were okay. I don't think, anything untoward happened. But man, the feeling of losing a child, of thinking they're not there. I don't know whether that's ever happened to you or whether you've lost someone else or whatever, but it's just this. You can imagine how Mary was feeling at the time. So they got this long journey back to find him, right, a day. And, no jumping in the car, no mobile phones, nothing in the day, taking them all that time. And they didn't even find him on that day. They found him the next morning. And here he is somewhere where he shouldn't have been. He was 12 years old. That's significant to the story because at the age of 12, Jewish boys are not part of the religious community yet. So he was kind of up there with his family, but it wasn't, maybe the next year they would have assumed that, but this year they didn't assume that Jesus would be there. So here he is starting to kind of push the boundaries a little bit perhaps, a little ahead of his time. I guess he had a lot to cover and a lot to do. He's pushing the boundaries, which can be a storm, right, for parents, for relationships, when people start pushing the boundaries and you're not ready for that. You know how that can feel as well. So they start with this really open conversation, which I think is really cool, actually, because back in the day, I'm not sure that a lot of children would be able to speak up the way Jesus did. But firstly, the first words we hear were from Mary and Joseph, who it clearly says felt very upset and hurt. Mary and Joseph, I guess maybe this emotion that they were feeling, it's like it's all suddenly all about them, isn't it? Why have you done this to us? Why have you done this to me? I'm your mother, I care for you. And they'd totally forgotten. It's interesting, isn't it? They had 12 years to prepare for the fact that Jesus was really special. There was something special about this kid. You would think that maybe it would have clicked for them, but it didn't. At that point, they were just his parents, and they were feeling hurt because Jesus had done something that was, in their mind, was very disobedient. There's a word that's called individuating, which is pulling away, and it needs to happen as we grow and as we mature, whether we're 12 or whether we're 22 or whether we're 56 or whether we're 90. We're still individuating and growing up and becoming a more mature person. But they weren't expecting it, and they're thinking to themselves, who is this child? Yesterday he was perfect, today he's doing his own thing. Have you ever thought that in a relationship? Who is this person? Who are you? I've always thought you're going to respond in this certain way in this relationship, in this context, and suddenly they do the opposite. They do something, and this sense of shock and hurt and upset that we feel when people do something differently, which is perhaps what they are feeling. When Jesus then says what I think must have been a bit of a shock and a bit of a slap, didn't you know I'd have to be in my Father's house? Why were you looking for me? It's such an interesting statement afterwards. It says they had no idea what he was talking about. Have you ever been again, that question or that thought comes to your mind in a relationship, I have no idea what you're talking about. And for the other person, they're just going, of course, I did this because of this reason. I did this because I'm feeling this. I did this. Remember, we talked about this. Remember, this is what we've been working on. And you're standing there going, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know who you are. I don't know what you're talking about. And at that point, you can just feel so hurt and offended and what's upset. Jesus, it said, he felt confused and misunderstood. These are Jesus' first recorded words in the Bible. This is such an important story for us to understand the humanity of Jesus. These are his first recorded words, and he says, didn't you know I'd have to be in my Father's house about my Father's business? Think about this from Jesus' perspective. I find this quite emotional when I think about it, because on the one hand, Jesus is way ahead of the pack. Nobody else has really understood his call. Here he is at 12 years of age, and he's beginning to understand the call on his life. He's beginning to understand that this is going to mean that he's going to have to separate himself from his family in order to be about his Father's business, in order to fulfill the call to be the Messiah. He's going to have to do all of those things. And so he is way ahead of the pack on one hand. On the other hand, he's a 12-year-old kid who has no idea that he should have told his mum and dad that he was going to go to the temple. Isn't it interesting that Jesus was both of those things? He was so mature and so insightful, way beyond his years, and yet he was such an ordinary 12-year-old boy, a beautiful 12-year-old kid that had no idea that was going to cause so much stress to his parents. It's possible, and I found in my life true, that I can be mature in one part of my life and really immature in another. And the journey of that moving toward more maturity is not an easy one. And along the way, I get hurt, other people get hurt. I feel misunderstood, and I'm sure you do too. We're trying to grow up, we're trying to be faithful family members and partners and parents and children. We're trying to honour God, and yet sometimes it kind of all just gets a bit messy and we get hurt and they get hurt. Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? So this is kind of like this really open conversation, which I think is really cool, and I think it's really important for us to remember in storms, in difficult times in our relationships, that it's really good to be able to talk about it and to say how we feel. But then I love their responses, and I'd like to just have a look at their responses, each of them. The first response is Joseph. Joseph said it best by saying, nothing at all. Do you know there's no recorded words of Joseph in the Bible at all? It's what's said about him. Joseph probably, this is the last time we hear of Joseph. They say I think Ree mentioned it recently, they say he died when Jesus was still young, before Jesus went into his ministry. But what we do hear about him is probably what's been written by Mary, and she just honours him as the most godly, humble man. That as he was called to father this child, to parent this child, to be an earthly dad for Jesus, even though it wasn't easy, he did it. And he stood there and watched this ministry begin to roll out in Jesus' life, and to hear Jesus say, I was in my Father's house. It must have felt like a slap. Ouch. And I imagine there was an urge to say, how dare you, you little brat? Don't you know what I've done for you? And yet there's nothing recorded of Joseph. Sometimes in our conflicts, in our relationships, we say it best when we say nothing at all. And that, I find, is the hardest thing in my life. A couple of weeks ago, something was happening. I'm really good at the open conversations, really good at that. I can do them quite well too, but saying nothing at all isn't easy. I had this situation with a close family member, and I felt like there was something happening there, and I knew in my heart I needed to be like Joseph. And so I managed to do that for about 2 days, and then it just got the better of me. So I called him up, listen, we need to talk. We need to talk. But truthfully, probably the best thing is for me to allow that family member to individuate and to do what they need to do. Sometimes in our relationships, and when storms come, it's best to be like Joseph and to say nothing at all. Then we come to Mary. What was Mary's response? It says that she held these things dearly, deep within her heart. She treasured them. The Greek word says she kept them safe. Where have we heard this statement before about Mary? At the birth, right? This other incredibly stormy time for her, where it says after all, everything happened, after the shepherds came, after the wise men came, after Jesus was born, according to the prophetic, all of that, the circumstances, it was mind-blowing. The Bible says that Mary kept these things in her heart. And here again, a second time, it says Mary treasured these things and she kept them down into her heart. She kept them safe. For me, looking at this, Mary is a wonderful mother. I think she's an amazing woman. You know, she just parented this boy so beautifully. But she's not just that. She's a wonderful steward of the things of God. We see in Mary's life she had this amazing love and deep faith, and she let things down deep. I don't know, I felt like I couldn't even kind of articulate this for you, but I'd like you to ask yourself this question. What does it mean for me to allow things to be deep in my heart? What does it mean for me to keep things safe that are difficult? What does it mean for me in a storm, in a relationship with somebody? What does it mean for me? What does it mean for you to allow something to go deep down into your heart? Maybe it's about allowing something to sit there and until I can see and have the courage to let it sit there until I can see what it's really about. Maybe it's something that I need to change in my life. And by taking it deep, I can allow God time, I can allow time itself to reveal to me what's actually really going on for me in this situation, in this relationship. What part of it's my problem? What part of it's somebody else's problem? What is God saying to me? What is God wanting to do? But Mary shows us a depth, we initially it's like, what have you done to us? But then she lets it go deeper. I think Mary probably lived with a lot of heartache, actually. She's there right through Jesus' life to the end. She's there when he was born, she was there when he died, she was there at the resurrection. I think Mary carried a lot of stuff deep in her heart. And she had a lot of time to ask God to help her to bear that load. And I think in our relationships, Mary is a role model for us in stormy times, to let things sit in our heart and to be courageous enough to allow that to happen. Jesus' response, it just says simply that he went home and he lived obediently with his parents like every well-behaved 12-year-old, and he continued to mature in body and in spirit. And Mary and Joseph continued to grow in their understanding of what it meant for him to be the Messiah. It's just very simple. Jesus needed to mature. This storm ushered in something new into his life, a new understanding. But he still had a lot of growth to do. And I think good storms in our relationships are all about the growth to do. And if we'll allow them, there are massive storms out there for people, I know that. But in our relationships, what I have learned is that the most growth, the greatest opportunity for things to go deep in my heart and for God to speak to me, the greatest opportunity for me to hold my tongue and be more like Joseph, the greatest opportunity for growth come from my closest relationships. Might not be massive world-breaking stuff, but in my world it is, and in yours it is too. It's with your parents, young people. It's with your kids' parents. It's with your friends. It's with your family. That God gives us this opportunity to grow through the storms within our relationship. I'd like to just finish with two verses which I think are really very precious on this topic. Hebrews 4:14-16 says, we don't have a priest who is out of touch with our reality. He's been through weakness and testing. He's experienced it all but the sin. So let's walk right up to him and get what he's ready to give. Take the mercy, accept the help. Right from this age, 12 years of old, young people, 12 years of age to our teenagers, you who feel, I don't need to really worry about all this sermon stuff, I'm just a kid. Jesus understands what you're going through. He's experienced it all as you are experiencing it, right through to the oldest of us. And the other verse says, James 1:2-4, says, consider it a sheer gift, friends, when tests and challenges come at you from all sides. You know that under pressure, your faith life is forced into the open and shows its true colours. So don't try and get out of anything prematurely. Let it do its work so you become mature and well-developed, not deficient in any way. If I'm really honest, I can see there's some deficiencies in my life still. I hope I'm maturing. I hope I'm becoming more like Jesus. And I'm sure you do too. Just we're all in that same boat. We all have relationships. We all have close people that we love that sometimes it gets a bit stormy with. But this is the idea, is that God's going to use it. What seems so just part of the fall, God's so cool, he says, it's all right. I'm going to take that and I'm going to make it work something very precious in your life and mature you as Jesus did. I was in funeral just finally recently, and this man was paying tribute to his friend. And he spoke about this friend that he loved very much. They'd been friends from childhood, and now they were in their 70s, and the deceased man was in his 70s when he died. And the friend just said something very simple. He said, he said the word friendships, but I've just changed it to relationships. He said the best relationships are the relationships like I had with my friend Alwyn, where we were able to grow individually, but we always remained close. And I think that's the gift that God has given us with our closest relationships, is that within them we can grow through these good storms, and yet we can remain close. We don't need to splinter off and have broken relationships, perhaps even relationships within your church family. Whatever it is, God wants to do a work in our heart through our closest relationships. Sometimes it feels like a storm. Sometimes it just feels like the warmest hug, or it is the warmest hug. It's a mixed bag, isn't it? But the goal of a good storm is maturity. And the goal of our relationships is to help us mature, our closest relationships. So just as we finish off, we've got a few minutes, and before we run off today, I really do believe that you're a lot like me, and that your closest relationships are those that God wants to use to mature you. So perhaps we could just quietly just reflect for a moment. Maybe, I don't know, you've been sitting for a while, maybe could I invite you to stand and just reflect today or now. I mean, maybe there are some here that are going through a storm in your relationships at the moment. Maybe you're a young person and you're struggling with your family, with your parents, or with the teacher, or a coach, or whatever. Maybe you're a spouse and it's just so hard. Maybe you're a friend, maybe you're a cousin, maybe you're a worker, co-worker. And you're just feeling like there's just this stormy thing happening. Do you need to take a leaf out of Joseph's book today? Do you need to take a leaf out of Mary's book today? Do we need to take a leaf out of Jesus' book today? Cut ourselves some slack and realise that, hey, we're not perfect, we're all still growing. Just stand for a moment in God's presence and allow His Holy Spirit to speak to you, like He did to Mary, like He did to Joseph, like He did to Jesus. Thank you, Jesus.